Today on Don't Talk TV, I thought it would be interesting to look at an American case that's had quite a bit of notoriety and do a what if and consider what would happen if these events had occurred in Canada. So I'm going to take a look at the case of Mark and Patricia McCloskey and how their case may have played out under Canadian self-defense law. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. So, late last week on June 17th, something came across my newsfeed that caught my eye, and that was the fact that Mark and Patricia McCloskey had pled guilty to some misdemeanors in relation to the events outside their home on June the 28th of 2020. Just as a refresher for those who may not remember who the McCloskeys are, on June 28th, 2020, during the George Floyd protests in St. Louis, Missouri, there was an incident where a number of protesters entered a private community, and this led to a standoff between Mr. and Mrs. McCloskey, who are both lawyers, and were both armed with firearms, which they're pointing the protesters. There was yelling back and forth. No shots were fired, no one was injured, but it did result in a number of charges against the McCloskeys. They were charged with unlawful use of a firearm, which carries a 4-year maximum penalty. It sounds like it would be similar to careless use of a firearm or point firearm with intent under Canadian law. So as indicated last week, they pled guilty. I'm just looking at a CBC article here, and it says that they pled guilty to misdemeanors. Patricia McCloskey pled guilty to misdemeanor harassment and was fined $2,000 US, and her husband, Mark McCloskey, pleaded guilty to misdemeanor 4th-degree assault and was fined $750 US. Now, as I said in the preamble, this case had notoriety across the world. It was reported all over the news, and the McCloskeys, especially Mark McCloskey, became somewhat of a political focal point. I believe Mr. McCloskey spoke at a national Republican gathering of some sort. But the case itself is very interesting, and it raises some really important questions about what are the limits of people to defend themselves and to defend their homes. So what I want to do is I'm going to take an interview from July the 1st, 2020, between Mark McCloskey and CNN's Chris Cuomo. I chose that interview because I don't think anyone would accuse CNN of being some right-wing partisan news outlet, so I figured this would be the most fair, or certainly couldn't be accused of being biased in favor of the McCloskeys, but it gives the point of view of Mr. McCloskey, which would inform a lot of the questions that arise in assessing a defense of self-defense under Canadian law. Before we dive into Mr. McCloskey's interview, let's just quickly look at Section 34 of the Criminal Code. So, Section 34 can be used as a defense to any charge. So it doesn't matter whether he was charged with assault with a weapon, uttering threats, pointing a firearm with intent, or careless use of a firearm. Section 34 could be used to defend any offense if A, the accused person believed on reasonable grounds that force is being used against them or another person, or that a threat of force is being made against them or another person. B, the act that constitutes the offense is committed for the purpose of defending or protecting themselves. And C, the act is reasonable in the circumstances. So let's take a look at what Mr. McCloskey had to say.
I was a person scared for my life who was protecting my wife, my home, my hearth, my livelihood. I was a victim of a mob that came through the gate. I didn't care what color they were. I didn't care what their motivation was. I was frightened, I was assaulted, and I was in imminent fear that they would run me over, kill me, burn my house.
So I think it's very clear from what Mr. McCloskey is saying that he subjectively believed that force was being used against him or another person. He says at various parts of the interview that he felt this was social terrorism. He makes reference to being threatened.
On the street screaming death threats at me and threatening to burn my house and kill my dog, and what rooms in my house they were going to live in after they killed me.
Now, as I mentioned in my self-defense series, there's also an objective aspect to it. So it's not just whether he subjectively believed that, it's also, is that objectively reasonable to think that? Now, this may come down part to a finding of fact in terms of whether threats were actually made. However, I think it's not controversial at all that there were a large number of angry, yelling individuals outside his house. And I think there can certainly be an argument made that an individual would reasonably believe that force is being exercised against them, keeping in mind again that an assault doesn't have to be physical contact. It can be a threatening gesture or something, an action that causes an individual to feel threatened. And with those large numbers and the heat of the moment, I think there's be a strong argument to be made that the McCloskeys would satisfy Part A of the test under Section 34. Keeping in mind, of course, that the counter-argument to the argument of the prosecution was that the protesters were completely peaceful. They never actually entered onto the property of the McCloskeys themselves. They were just in the housing development, and that they made no threats of any kind. So if that were the finding of the court, the self-defense would fail. Subsection B requires that the act that's done is done for the purpose of self-defense. So Mr. McCloskey is completely clear that the reason he and his wife armed themselves was to defend themselves. Subsection B of Section 34, that's a purely subjective test, so they clearly meet that part of the test. Subsection C is the act of arming themselves and pointing firearms in the direction of these individuals reasonable in the circumstances. So Section 34, sub 2, lays out a number of factors to be considered in determining whether the act committed is reasonable in the circumstances. And then there's listed here, A to H, a number of considerations. So let's just take these each in turn. 34, sub 2, sub A, the nature of the force or threat. So the nature of the force or threat is twofold. One,
all I knew was that hundreds of people screaming, shouting, angry, broke through the private gate. Everything inside that gate is private property.
Right.
And two, it's people making overt threats. So in the face of that, I think it's reasonable to be arming oneself, especially given the large disparity of numbers. Subsection B, whether the use of force was imminent. Now, the people are right there on their steps. The counter-argument that a prosecutor would use is that these people never actually came up the steps or tried knocking down the door. Although, again, on the flip side, Mr. McCloskey's argument is, well, yes, that's because we armed ourselves, and as soon as they started approaching, they backed off. Subsection C considers what role did the accused person have in the situation. Now, a prosecutor would likely argue that the McCloskeys escalated the situation by introducing firearms into that scenario. But again, the counter-argument is their role was that they were simply sitting inside their home when these individuals burst onto their property. So it's not a scenario where they had leveled some threats or they had made some very provocative public statements that led these individuals to be coming to their residence. These people were just at home minding their own business when suddenly there's hundreds of people on their property and they were scared and armed themselves. Subsection D considers whether any party in the incident was armed with a weapon. Now, as far as I've been able to discern from the various news reports, none of the protesters were armed. The McCloskeys were the only ones who had firearms in this incident. So that may be a factor that would count against them in assessing whether their actions were reasonable. However, just because your attacker is unarmed doesn't mean you're not allowed to arm yourself. Just one example of case law that comes to my mind off the top of my head is the 2018 decision of the Ontario Court of Appeal, Her Majesty the Queen and Matteo Asensio, and I'll put the citation in the show description below. But that was a case where an individual armed himself with a baseball bat because he was being attacked by a group of individuals. I think an argument by analogy could be made here that when McCloskeys are confronted by hundreds of individuals, that they're fearful, it's reasonable for them to use a firearm as an equalizer. Subsection E takes into account the size, age, gender, and physical capabilities of the parties to the incident. Now, again, I think a consideration is the numbers of people involved, but also the consideration that the McCloskeys appear to be middle-aged individuals. I don't know how strong they are, but it appears that a lot of the protesters were a lot younger, healthier, stronger. So again, that's a consideration of why those individuals may feel it's reasonable to arm themselves in the face of that threat. Subsection F considers the nature, duration, and history of any relationship between the parties to the incident. Now, here the parties weren't known to each other directly, but I think it would be relevant to consider what was in the minds of the McCloskeys and things that they'd seen happen recently, such as Mark McCloskey mentioned in this part of the interview.
And you have to have this in the context of St. Louis, where on June the 2nd of this year, I watched the city burn. I watched the 7-Eleven get smashed in, looted, and burned for 40 minutes on live television with nobody showing up to do anything. And I realized at that time we're on our own. When bad things happen, they unpredictably turn really bad, real fast. That same night, retired St. Louis Police Captain David Dorn was murdered.
And having that in mind may make it more reasonable for him to feel that he needs to arm himself, and that's certainly an argument that the defense would make. Then subsection G considers the nature and proportionality of the person's response. So again, this comes back to the pulling out firearms and introducing them into this scenario where they're confronted with a group of individuals. Although it's a large group of individuals, it's a group of unarmed individuals. But again, in terms of proportionality, I keep coming back to the fact that there's hundreds of individuals versus these two outside their home. And that's certainly the argument that the McCloskeys made repeatedly through numerous interviews, not just this one with Chris Cuomo, that they felt they had to arm themselves because of being so outnumbered. And I think a strong argument could be made that in those particular circumstances, it's reasonable to arm oneself with a firearm as an equalizer. And arguably, they would say that it worked because it stopped the attack, and it stopped the attack without anyone being injured, either on the part of the McCloskeys or the part of the protesters. Finally, subsection H considers whether the person knows that the force they're defending against was lawful. That certainly doesn't apply here. I think all parties agreed that the protesters were trespassing. They were acting unlawfully. And you can even see footage where they're going through the gate that demarcates the private property from the public. Given all of that, and in this hypothetical of if this happened in Canada, in my view, there would be actually some quite strong arguments. And in my view, there would be a reasonably good prospect of the McCloskeys being successful in a defense under Section 34 of the Criminal Code of Canada. Now, that said, when facing a charge with 4-year maximum and then being offered a $750 fine and no weapons prohibition, I think I can see why they decided to take that plea bargain. And as a defense lawyer, it would probably be something that I would tell a client to think very long and hard about when there's a risk of much more severe consequences after a trial. But of course, this video is not legal advice. If you are in a situation where you need legal advice, and certainly in keeping with the topic of this, if you're in a situation where there's been a self-defense and you've been charged, don't rely on this video. Call a lawyer to get advice. You can call another lawyer, or you can call myself. My 1-855 number, my website are listed below. And a lawyer can give you specific advice tailored to the circumstances that you're facing. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments section below or send me an email. And if you found this video helpful or informative, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing and following me on social media.